I'm Aaron David Miller, and this is Carnegie Connects. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this world of ours. I hope you're all safe and sound. I'm Aaron David Miller, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a set of virtual discussions, at least for now, on issues of critical importance to America and the world. Today, I'm really pleased, especially pleased to host Helima Croft. Helima is the managing director, and I want to get this right, Helima, the managing director and head of global commodity strategy and Middle East and North Africa research at RBC Capital Markets. So, Helima, first of all, welcome to Carnegie Connects.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to see you. And I can think of nobody, seriously, I mean, having listened to you 2 or 3 times in the last several weeks, I can think of nobody better or more experienced to help us sort through both the headlines and the trend lines in today's, I guess I'm understating this, complex global energy environment. But before we get into all that internal tick-tock about oil, I usually ask the guests on the show to tell us a bit about their personal background, at least professionally, their personal professional perspective. And I had Madeleine Albright on the show last fall before she passed away. I worked for her for a bit at the Department of State. And she told a remarkable story about going through customs at Heathrow. The Brits had some question about one of her documents. This is after she left Foggy Bottom, after her tenure. And frustrated, she said to the customs officials, "Do you know who I am?" And the Brits replied, as only the Brits could, "No, but we have very good doctors that could help you figure that out." So let me ask you, from the professional point of view, Helima Croft, who are you? Tell us a little bit about your professional background and how you came to be where you are now.
So I run a commodity research group at the Royal Bank of Canada. I started my sort of professional career after graduating from Princeton with a PhD in economic history in 2001. I joined the CIA in December of 2001, December 1st, 2001. And it was a really, very transformative time to be in the intelligence community. I had a background working on sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East on commodity issues. And I joined a group of analysts that were looking at these sort of global economic issues around security of energy. And I was the analyst actually covering Nigeria, the economic analyst. And it was a really interesting time because there was this whole conversation, as you remember, about energy dependency. There was a sense that potentially Saudi Arabia was running out of oil. Remember Matt Simmons and that whole thesis? And there was this view in the administration that energy security came through diversity of supply. And so we were very focused as the US government on sourcing oil from different parts of the world. And so hence being an analyst covering Nigeria was actually a good career path in the intelligence community at the time, because Nigeria was producing around 2.3 to 2.5 million barrels a day on any given day. But there was this expectation that when they were able to bring on, offshore fields, that their production would grow to 4 million barrels a day. And there was a whole conversation about, should we developing relations with countries like Nigeria as they grow their production, easier to get their oil, shorter shipping times. But we also saw countries like Nigeria as emerging democracies, and questions about, are these the type of governments that we should be partnering with in the future? Now, I think it's interesting because if I think about 2001, Nigeria producing around 2.3 to 2.5 and the expectation of 4, on any given day, Nigeria struggles to produce 2 million barrels a day now. And so there's a really interesting question about what happened in a country like Nigeria that it wasn't able to reach its production potential. What does that mean for the 200 million plus citizens that live there? But that was a really interesting time for me. And then I went to the Council on Foreign Relations. I was an intelligence fellow there, and I worked on a project on how can we have countries, or what type of tools are there to help countries think about better managing their oil revenue so they don't get stuck in situations like Nigeria, where they were having militancy issues about environmental degradation from the oil industry. And I was also on a task force on energy and national security, which was very interesting, where we're thinking about what does it mean for the United States to be dependent on foreign oil pre-shale revolution. And so now that we have this abundant resource in the United States, that raises all interesting questions about what foreign policy changes come from that or that don't come from that.
Right.
But professionally, I moved from CIA, CFR to Wall Street, joined Lehman Brothers. That's a whole other story about Lehman Brothers pre-financial crisis. But that was really my transition to Wall Street, was really 2005, 2006. And I've been working on these energy issues, outlook for energy markets since then.
Now that you brought up Lehman Brothers, I've been focused lately on Saudi Arabia, and my own view is that unlike Lehman Brothers, there's a view in the U.S. government now that the U.S.-Saudi relationship is simply too big to fail. But we're gonna talk about that. I want to ask you one more question before we move on to the substance about the CIA and intelligence. I mean, I worked as an intelligence analyst for 4 or 5 years at INR, and the tsunami of information that you get on a daily basis forces you to choose, to prioritize, to sift through what matters from what doesn't. But if you had to identify the downside of being in a hermetically sealed environment at the agency, surrounded by all this info, in terms of your capacity to analyze the world accurately, what do you think the downside is?
I mean, first of all, I would say I loved being an intelligence analyst, young in my career at the agency, because I loved that sense of all this information coming in, kid in a candy store, getting into the office at 4 o'clock in the morning and being told you better sift through this as fast as possible because you might have to write a PDB, so figure out the story.
Right.
But, the downsides were, not being able to pick up the phone. Like, I was an economic analyst, and I did rotation at Treasury, and it was great to be at Treasury because, oh my God, I could talk to the IMF if I had a question. And at the time, you actually couldn't call the IMF if you had a question about a country you were covering. So the ability to pick up phones, to go to countries, as quickly as you need to figure out what's going on. So there are all types of sort of conversations you can have with foreign nationals. That can be sometimes a challenge at the intelligence community. But I do think that it was one of the greatest analytic training grounds you can ever have as someone interested in foreign policy. I joke, it's the mother of all postdocs is to go to the CIA.
Yes. I mean, I think you're right. I talking to my CIA colleagues at the time, the State Department was different. You could basically call anybody, and you could basically go anywhere. I did a TDY in Jordan for a bit during that period. So yeah, I mean, I think it is a downside, but clearly you've emerged as one of the top oil and energy analysts in the country, if not in the international community. So I agree with you on analytical training. So let's jump right into it. Let's take a big step back and take a look from 30,000 feet. Then we'll focus on the granular. We've had energy crises before. 1973, in the wake of the Arab-Israeli War, October War. 1979, the Iranian Revolution. Persian Gulf War I, when millions of barrels came off the market. How does what we're witnessing today differ fundamentally from those previous oil disruptions, and how much is the same?
Well, I think it's interesting is to take this actually back to 2020, because I feel like we've been in so much volatility since 2020. Or I could actually take it back to September 14th, 2019, when we had half of Saudi Arabia's oil, exports temporarily knocked offline because of cruise missile attacks. But if we think about 2020, we had the biggest collapse in demand in history because of the COVID pandemic. And we actually had, in the midst of that, this price war between Russia and Saudi Arabia for a brief period. Remember, oil actually went negative for a while. And there was all this conversation in 2020 when we had the price collapse of, are we seeing the end of oil? Is this peak demand? And are these Gulf states essentially going to have to find a new business model because we're rapidly moving ahead with this energy transition and we're not going to need these products going forward? And that's that. And I think what we didn't see at the time was the investment that was coming out of the sector meant that when we had a reopening from COVID with the lifting of these lockdown restrictions, that there could be this gap in terms of available supply to meet demand before we got to the energy transition stage that governments in the West were sort of hoping to get to, 2030 and onwards. And so if we go back to like February 23rd, the day before the invasion, we already had a very, very tight oil market. Like I was actually in Saudi Arabia 2 weeks before the invasion at an International Energy Forum, IEA, OPEC symposium. And we had $90 Brent at that point. And many analysts who did not think there would be a Russian invasion of Ukraine, who basically took the position of the Europeans that the Russians wouldn't do this, they still had forecasts for oil touching 100 over the summer because of this sort of tight market. And so the fact that you now have this war involving not only one of the world's
Well, we seem to have lost Helima for a minute there. We're working on getting her. There you are.
I'm back. I don't know what happened, but I'm back.
I didn't want to miss anything from that. But your answer prompts a question. Are you suggesting that the market was already tight in large part because oil companies, fearful of another boom and bust cycle, and Wall Street investors didn't make the proper investments either in hydrocarbons or others in renewables? I mean, what were we primed for a disaster?
I mean, I'm not ascribing a value judgment to this. What we simply saw was a massive contraction in investment as people thought about demand not being there. We did not know what the post-COVID recovery would look like. I mean, think about it, before the vaccines emerged, what did we think the world we'd be living in would look like? And so some of these were decisions about, we don't know when there will be a reopening. There were questions about, you had shale investors in the United States essentially saying shale is not a winning investment. And so the 2020 moment was such a period of profound uncertainty that I don't think it's necessarily surprising that you had this pullback in investment, because again, we witnessed such a profound collapse in demand and nobody knew what the road forward would look like in terms of when we'd get this economic reopening. But on the back of the success of vaccines and the reopening that we saw, we simply did not have necessarily the spare capacity needed to have a flush oil market. And so we've had a number of, if you look at OPEC, for example, OPEC made the decision in July of last year to start adding barrels back to the market. And what we've seen is that a number of countries have struggled to add barrels back because they don't have the supply, or they have infrastructure problems. They can't easily bring these barrels to the market. So we're back in a situation where we just have a small handful of countries that can fill any gap. And that's when we get to Russia. And the fact is, as I said, Russia is such a major oil exporter, natural gas exporter. You can talk about ags as well, and metals. But if you're looking at a situation where you have to say, now I may have to think about millions of barrels of Russian oil exports not finding a home, how do I fill this gap?
So it's February 24th. The Russians invade. They're responsible for what? 1 out of every 10 barrels of oil. 50% of their oil goes to Europe, a smaller amount to the United States. But monthly transactions of billions of dollars into the Russian economy. So the international community, the United States, the EU, NATO, in a rare example of alliance management, steps up and passes all of these comprehensive, funds the Ukrainian war effort, slaps on sanctions that could be described as a sort of drops a nuclear bomb on the Russian economy. And yet, there appears to be, even with this massive disruption, an adjustment. China and India are basically bankrolling Putin's war effort. interestingly enough, the U.S. Navy in the Persian Gulf is protecting Chinese supply lines. They're getting a free ride from our security investment. So where are we now in terms of the Russian component in this European and global balance of supply and demand? We're 4 months in.
I think the first thing to step back is and think about February 25th. I think there was an expectation in many capitals in Western Europe and certainly the United States that this would be a short war, that Russia would overwhelm Ukraine and that the Ukrainians would fight valiantly, but essentially it would be Russian troops in Kyiv if that was their end destination 3 or 4 weeks in. And so the sanctions that were put in place initially were designed to send a powerful message to Putin, but they were also designed to cause as minimal disruption to oil and gas markets as possible. Yes, we disconnected key Russian financial institutions from the SWIFT payment system, but we did carve-outs for energy. Remember this phrase, we hurt them, not us. The goal initially was to keep the oil flowing, make Russia take a discount, in terms of the revenue, but it was not to take the barrels off the market. It was not the Iran strategy. It was not the strategy to remove Russian barrels from the market because, again, Aaron, February 23rd, we already had a very tight oil market. Remember, you had Jake Sullivan out in August of last year saying we need more OPEC barrels. We had a release from a strategic petroleum reserve in November. So the administration, it wasn't just the Biden administration, but European governments as well were very focused on we need to keep the Russian molecules flowing. And that, I think, has put Western governments in a bind as they think about how do you respond to Putin. Because it does signal to Putin, hey, if I really want to be disruptive, if I really want to lead to questions about your willingness to see this through, let's try a little energy disruption. And I think we're seeing that really play out right now in the case of the way the Russians are slashing gas exports into Europe. And you now have the head of the IEA, Fatih Birol, out saying Europe may have to go without Russian gas entirely come winter. And so that is really we complain about $5 a gallon gasoline in the United States. Europe is looking at rationing. They're looking at industrial curtailments. If Russia is really intent on, turning the taps on gas on Europe, and they're cutting gas this summer to also prevent the building of necessary gas storage as you head into winter. Europe is facing a profound economic crisis from this war. And so I think that is, again, it has led to this anxiety about what's the way forward in terms of penalizing Russia. And we see this playing out on this issue of price caps as well.
Yeah, we're going to get that. In a globalized world, it works both ways. Hallelujah, the world is connected. But if the world is connected, guess what happens? You have a boomerang effect. So I wanted to ask you, people keep telling me, just wait another 4 months, wait another 6 months, wait until all these energy sanctions on gas. And right now they're on the oil is flowing on pipeline, right? But not by tanker. And I don't know where they are in refined diesel product. But what happens when all of these nation-crushing sanctions, economy kick in? Is that going to make a difference? It may raise the price of oil.
Yeah, this is, again, watch what happens in January. And this is the issue about, Europe right now has announced sanctions that will essentially say, come January 1, there'll be a couple small exemptions for Hungary and Slovakia. But by and large, there'll be no seaborne imports into Europe from Russia. And also, Germany and Poland are going to halt pipeline imports as well. So you're talking about sort of 2.2 to 2.4 million barrels of Russian oil that will not have a home. Now, this is, I think that if I leave you with nothing, this is why this issue of shipping and insurance are very important sanctions. Because we have seen this dramatic rise in Indian imports of Russian oil. If you basically can, get oil at a $30, $35 discount, which India is now getting of Russian, oil, they're going to back that truck up and take that oil. So Indian imports have grown by like tenfold. We've seen imports, Russian imports have surged into China as well. They're flowing into Turkey. But the shipping and insurance sanctions become really important because 60% of Russian oil is carried on Greek flag tankers. If the European Union sanctions that would prohibit those vessels from carrying those cargoes, if those come into effect, it's going to become a lot more complicated, not impossible, but a lot more complicated for India to continue to be securing the same volume of Russian cargoes. And then you add on insurance sanctions. Who insures those cargoes? It's UK and European firms that dominate the provision of insurance services to ship those cargoes. Again, there are some workarounds, but not easy workarounds. So what you could be talking about come January 1 is not the game of musical barrels, where essentially the European barrels go into Asia and then maybe some Middle Eastern barrels that were going into Asia are now displaced by Russia and go into Europe. If you have shipping and insurance sanctions, you may be talking about removing barrels from the market and not having a home. And that's what I think is making policymakers in Washington very nervous, hence why all this conversation about price caps. Right. Essentially saying, Europe, let's rethink your shipping and insurance sanctions. Why don't you simply say to Reliance refineries, hey, you know what? You have to tell the Russians that they need to basically accept, a $60 discount in order for us to be able to move this on a European flagged vessel. That is what this whole issue at price caps is. Finding a way that you reduce the revenue that Vladimir Putin gets from these sales into Asian markets, while at the same time ensuring or trying to ensure that those barrels still move into Asian markets. So the musical barrels game can continue.
But I think you pointed out in a note, if I'm in fact, the price of oil could actually increase because of the uncertainties. Everybody's got to be on the same page for this to essentially work. And China and India have to cooperate. And let me ask you this: what are the Indians doing with all this oil? Are they Are they refining and re-exporting it?
Yeah, that becomes a really important point as well, which I think is causing some anxiety. Because again, if you are Reliance refineries, like one of the refining behemoths in this world, and it becomes harder for you to take Russian barrels, what are you potentially doing to the products market right now? So I think there is, and we have a very, very tight, we can really go deep on this. We have shortages on products as well. And Russia is a major exporter of refined petroleum products. And a sanction that the EU announced is 8 months from now, they're also barring importation of products as well. And so this question about how you can transport Russian crude and products, that's going to be really important. And again, if India can't get those barrels or has to reduce their intake, what does that mean for the products market? But again, I think it's going to be really important to see what happens with these shipping insurance sanctions, because the price cap, you think what Schultz said today, everybody agrees in principle on a price cap. The mechanics are challenging, and getting agreement in terms of who sets the price cap, who enforces the price cap. And I think the biggest potential point of failure with all of these measures to try to say, we're going to deprive Putin of revenue, but we don't want to tighten the market, so we don't want to disrupt the flow of energy. The problem is, and the single point of failure is, Russia may not play ball. And there is a real risk. And we're seeing this movie play out on natural gas now, with the Russians slashing exports through pipelines like Nord Stream 1, saying there are technical issues because you can't get certain equipment because of sanctions. Most people think this is a very political move. We've seen this movie. And the question is Russia going to say, well, I have no choice. I need to sell my barrel, so I'm going to sell it. I'm going to go forward with this discount mechanism. Or am I going to start cutting oil exports this summer and raising the price and seeing how much economic pain you guys are really willing to endure for backing Ukraine? I think that's always the big risk. And there's some like Robin Brooks, who I think has been, phenomenal in terms of his writing on this. I think one of the best economists covering this. And he has said that, this leads to whole questions about Was it a mistake initially to signal that like we weren't going to touch energy? Like, should we have been more in control of the narrative with the Russians by moving more aggressively from the outset to target oil and gas? Because now we're kind of at the mercy of the Russians deciding when they're going to cut flows.
Right. Okay. So let's leave Russia and Europe for the moment, but in a globalized world, we really can't escape it forever, and move on to one of my favorite parts of the world, the Middle East. The first book I ever wrote was on Saudi Arabian oil and American foreign policy. So I've been interested in this subject for a long time. So before you leave this podcast, we're going to get to the bottom of spare capacity and exactly, regardless of political circumstances, what can the Saudis actually do on this? But our president is off to Saudi Arabia. I think if there had been no Russian invasion, I doubt, frankly, despite all the other legitimate reasons for taking this trip, there probably would not have been the urgency to begin a sort of Mohammed bin Salman rehab project. But the president's going. Oil is clearly an important part of this. Let's just talk about, apart from any of the politics, from Israel, from Jamal Khashoggi, from MBS the reformer, the ruthless, reckless authoritarian, what are the Saudis willing and able to do with respect to making up for this seemingly dire shortage that we have globally? What can they actually do? And what are the elements that go into the oil-related elements, not the politics, the oil-related elements that go into understanding their thinking?
I mean, I think that the Saudis have been pretty transparent, in terms of saying, like, look, United States, like, you keep coming to us, and Western leaders, G7, you keep coming to us and saying, we need more of your oil. And the Saudis and the rest of OPEC have said, like, look, just look at our production numbers. We're struggling. We at RBC, we hosted an event with the outgoing Secretary General of OPEC a couple of weeks ago, and he said, like, look, we've got like 2 to 3 producers that have any additional barrels. Like, we're maxed out as a group. And the real question is that if you did ask the few countries, and I really think this comes down to Saudi Arabia. Yes, UAE has probably a bit of spare capacity. We can talk about the Macron comments, but this really comes down to what spare capacity you could define as what you can bring on in 30 days and, keep on for 90 days.
3 months.
So if you're thinking about like what you could potentially bring on in 30 and keep on in 90, we look at the April 2020 numbers as kind of an interesting reference point. I mean, it's not the Bible, but it's an interesting point to look back in time, because in April 2020, you had this price war between Saudi Arabia and Russia. I was actually at that OPEC meeting in March where the Russians refused to essentially cut by an additional 300,000 barrels and join this big cut because they were very concerned about COVID. And the whole meeting broke apart. And you had this price war commence between the Saudis and the Russians. And I think the Saudis actually won that price war, by the way, and we can talk about that. Like, the Saudis were so clear in March of 2020 that the Russians, if they were not going to agree to cut, they were basically going to push their barrels onto the market and show the costs of not working together. And, I think about like that strategy. They were very resolute. Like, I was there when it started, and they were basically like, no, we're not going to blink. They're going to blink. And I look at April 2020 because that was the month where we really saw that we're not going to blink. We're going to win this, and we're going to get them back to the table. And if you look at those numbers, when you think they probably didn't hold back much in pursuit of that strategy, and they slashed their domestic refining runs to get barrels out. If you look at that, you could say, well, feasibly, we look at that and say they can probably do 1 million extra. Like, that might be a soft ceiling. So it's beyond the number as clearly that Emmanuel Macron said yesterday when he did the hot mic take and said it's 150,000. So it's beyond 150,000. It might be, 1 million. It might be a bit above 1 million, but we potentially are losing 1 million Libyan barrels right now. I mean, the ability to have a shock absorber to deal with any major supply disruption, if Saudi Arabia exhausts that now, the question is does the market say, okay, we feel better because we have an additional 1 million out there, or 1.5 million? Or are we now worried because we don't have anything else. And you look at
Okay.
the strategic, that's the problem, spare
Right.
capacity.
Right. So risk aversion rather than risk readiness is going to govern their calculations because they want OPEC discipline, OPEC plus discipline. They are worried and they don't know what Russia is going to do with respect to responding to additional sanctions. What happens when European sanctions kick in fully by the end of the year? All of these things are blinking red or at least yellow for them. And what, if anything, do you think, what signals have they sent to us that over time, maybe in September, maybe in December, maybe in 2023, they're prepared to do incremental production increases?
Well, we got a signal at the last OPEC meeting where they decided to switch it up a bit. I mean, since July, when they came up with this agreement to start adding barrels back, we've had these very, very short OPEC meetings virtually. We don't have the press conferences anymore, so we don't have the Hollywood squares where analysts are like asking the minister questions, which I loved, by the way. We've had these very short 11, 12-minute meetings, and they basically said, we agreed in July. And by the way, remember, we had a couple of weeks sort of meltdown over this agreement with the UAE and Saudi. There were issues around like the formula for adding barrels back. But since they got that arrangement, they've been sticking to the script. Last month, they decided, you know what? We're going to bring forward the barrels. We have 3 months left on this production increase. We're going to basically make it a 2 month. So they are adding barrels back. They basically said, instead of doing 430 a month, we're going to do 648 for the next 2 months. So we get to August, and that cut is unwound. Now, the agreement remains in place, though. So the question is, between September and December, is there some mechanism where they can stay together as a group? Because I think the Saudis are very clear they want to keep the group together. But can you find ways to bring more barrels back while staying within this OPEC framework? So I think they could find a way, because again, a number of countries have not been producing to their OPEC quotas. Do they say we're going to backfill that so they technically stay compliant with the agreement? I would expect that adding the barrels back is going to be done in a way that doesn't rupture this OPEC plus marriage and keeps Russia on side for now.
Right. I would agree. It's in keeping with a certain transactional nature of the way they're doing business these days. I do want to move. Actually, and I ask you one question about Iran. My friend Rob Malley is now in Qatar. You're going to have some form of resumed negotiations, courtesy of the Europeans. The odds are somewhere less than 50% and more than zero. These negotiations seem to have two speeds, slow and slower, but I still would not rule out a significant breakthrough. Would that make a difference?
Yeah. I think every barrel matters in this market. And essentially, when you could think about, is there a mechanism to get an additional 1 million barrels of Iranian exports on the market? Because the U.S. released from Strategic Petroleum Reserve, that winds down in October. And we have this requirement that you have to have 90 days of import cover. And so we cannot do another blockbuster SPR release after October, end of October. And so an additional 1 million barrels of Iranian exports would not be trivial to the market at this stage. That said, though, I think we miss a couple of things, and you know this better than anyone else, and Bob Malley knows this better than anybody else. The architecture of sanctions relief would mean that Iran would have to first become compliant with the agreement, and these are congressional sanctions, in order to essentially say to any exporter around the world, like, you're free to take those Iranian barrels and still access U.S. capital markets. And so even in a scenario where we were to get a breakthrough, it's not a light switch. And I think that's something that oftentimes market participants don't fully get, that you can't just say, okay, JCPOA 2.0, and tomorrow I get an additional 1 million barrels on the market. And so there still is like a lag time in terms of like becoming compliant with the agreement before those barrels hit the water. But that's still, if you had 1 million extra barrels, that could certainly help the situation. And that's why the French are out there saying, let's get the Iranian barrels back. Let's get the Venezuelan barrels back. Like, that's why you're having certain European countries like, let's get this done.
Right. Okay, so let's turn to the U.S. The mystery of energy independence. So 15 years ago, we were importing 2/3 of the oil we consume. Last year, we exported more than we imported, but we remain seemingly just as vulnerable. So oil trades in a single market. It's sort of like a unified whole. Gas prices are up 50% from what they were last year. Explain to our viewers and listeners why. And then the specific question is, why are, look, driving down the district, I'm looking at the gas stations, the signs, and every American sees this almost every day. Why are gas prices so high?
Okay, let's start with your last question, and then we can work our way back to energy independence. Good. Or not dependence. I think that one thing, the investment story also really holds for refinery capacity as well.
Yep.
And we have not built a major refinery in the United States since the late 70s.
1977, actually.
Yeah, that is when we think about, again, like a reopening and people getting back on the road and people getting in planes, like you have a tight oil market, but you now have real refinery capacity issues. And we lost significant refining capacity, 1.5 million barrels a day during the pandemic. And so it's not simply a situation that we have a tightness in terms of barrels coming out of the ground. We have a shortage of facilities that can refine those products. And you also have, again, this is where it goes to Russia as well. Russia's a major refined product exporter. So we're also concerned that other countries that are refined products exporters are going to be, not able to export at the previous levels. And the problem the administration has is there is no SPR, no Strategic Petroleum Reserve, for refinery capacity. Mm-hmm. And so that is we've talked about this before. Unfortunately, this oil market is going to probably have to be balanced by demand. There's probably going to have to be demand destruction, changes in consumption that will balance this market. And Europe is already there. I mean, you have European leaders having the kind of conversation saying, we need to curb consumption. And that is something where the United States, we're starting to have that conversation, but we're not where the Europeans are in that conversation. This is not an easy market to fix in terms of policy. And we're already running through policy options that would seem to try to deal with, we've done the SPR already. We are probably going to get more barrels from Saudi Arabia, but the quantity is finite. We're talking, we talked about a gas tax holiday. It's unlikely probably to pass Capitol Hill. You could watch what governors do. But the issue about a gas tax is it lead to more consumption. So again, the ultimate painful truth of this market right now is it's going to be probably demand and consumption changes that bring down prices.
Right. Let me quote, I'm sure you know her, Amrita Sen, the chief oil analyst, energy aspect in London. Listen to what she says. This is last week. Quote, this whole thing is going to end in disaster. The problem is that we are sleepwalking into probably one of the biggest recessions of all time. Demand up for oil and gas is simply too high versus supply, and governments aren't taking enough measures to lower demand or increase production, in large part because they are still constrained by their pro-climate agendas. There needs to be some realism in government across the board. Demand is too high. It needs to come down hard, unquote. Is she right?
I worked with Amrita for years at Barclays. She's a phenomenal analyst. And I was with her in Saudi Arabia where she had a great line. It wasn't off the record, so I can quote her, but she said, governments need to have honest conversations with their citizens. And I think that one of the failures right now in the United States, I think it's a specter of Jimmy Carter. I think that the political cost, particularly with midterm elections, to come out and say to citizens in this country that unfortunately we have a confluence of factors that are not easy to solve. You're going to have to think about changing consumption patterns and also saying, there is a price. If we hold these values to be dear in terms of our support for Ukraine being about preservation of, the post-war security architecture in Europe and the principle you cannot invade another sovereign nation, unfortunately, it's not a cost-free position to take. And so I do think that political cycles do not make this easy to have that kind of conversation. But that is the conversation that needs to be had. And the more we focus on things like SPR and gas tax, I sometimes think that the American public believes that there's some quick lever to pull. Like, if only you could restart Keystone XL, which wasn't, was completed in Canada, but not in the United States and held up in court challenges. If only you could have this sort of quick fix, we could solve this problem. But unfortunately, this is not a situation that is going to be solved quickly through additional supply. It's a situation, unfortunately, that's going to be solved through demand, as long as this war continues.
Right. And unfortunately, with the sort of pernicious polarization that affects our politics here, we cannot have honest and serious discussions, let alone action, on climate, on immigration, on abortion. I mean, we're headed into a bad patch. And I don't want to close on an annoyingly negative note. Although I must say, Helima, your reputation has preceded you. I mean, real clarity and real honesty in this conversation, and it's greatly appreciated. I wanted to ask one final question about the balance between energy security, which seems to be the focus, and climate. I mean, you can't even say energy security is today and climate is tomorrow. The fact is, climate is now. But governing is about choosing and trying to figure out a way, the transition from where we are now to where we would like to go with respect to climate is going to be long, arduous, incredibly complicated. But how even now do we try to find that balance between energy security and transition to renewables?
I think that we see this playing out so perfectly over the issue of natural gas, because you think about the Obama administration, and U.S. natural gas exports was seen as actually serving Paris climate goals by helping, move coal out of the energy mix, and about, trying to break Europe's dependence on Russian gas. Like, it was seen as actually serving climate and energy security goals, U.S. natural gas exports. But then we decided that, that maybe natural gas doesn't have a role in the transition, where many developing nations were saying, you talk to India or sub-Saharan African nations, like, they still wanted natural gas to be part of the conversation in terms of their transition fuel. So I do think that this crisis has led to a reappraisal of that role of natural gas in the transition. I know that does not make every climate activist happy, but I think that is sort of where we're landing in this conversation about achieving climate goals and energy security, is a greater emphasis on natural gas exports. Now, there are questions about, when you build out the infrastructure, are you building stranded assets? That all those issues are coming up. But I think that the really worrying development has to be the fact that we're restarting coal plants. I mean, that, to me, you look at what's happening in Germany,
right.
and their decision to, abandon nuclear. I mean, I think all of these are really hard choices. And the thing I also really worry about is keeping the public on side for these necessary and important energy transition policies. Like, if you have a situation come winter, I mean, I'm so laser focused on Europe for winter. If you have a situation in Europe for winter where people are sort of choosing between heating and eating, like, what does that do for, like, popular support for a lot of these necessary but difficult policies?
All too true. We've come to the end of the 45 minutes. I cannot thank you enough. I hope at some point you'll come back. I have a feeling we're not going to be done with this energy crisis. I think it's fair to describe it as such for quite a while. So hopefully you will come back. You were brilliant, to say the least. And again, honesty and clarity and analysis is critically important if we're going to even begin to understand the world, let alone try to fix it. So I want to thank you again, Helima Croft. To Carnegie Connect's viewers and listeners, Our next Carnegie Next will be on July 11 with former DNI James Clapper. Will be an interesting conversation on the role of intelligence in American foreign policy and a tour of the world with General Clapper. So until then, think positive and definitely test negative. And Helima, thank you so much once again.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bye-bye.